This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. Well, we haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture, and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett, and for the first time I'm joined by a real Primitive Culture round table. We've got a whole group here. We've got Tony in person, live in the flesh. It's Tony Black.
Not that much in the flesh, that sounds worrying. I'm here.
It's not that kind of evening. We've got a friend of the network, Clara Cook.
Hello.
And we've got Tony Robinson from Continuing Mission.
Hello, I'm Tony Robinson from Corpus Christi College, Oxford, and I'm reading economics.
Very good. And to start the discussion this evening, basically the reason that we've all gathered here today is that we are at the Prince Charles Cinema in London's Leicester Square, and we've come for a very exciting event. It's actually the UK premiere, I believe, of the director's extended cut of Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan. So we've gathered here to come and enjoy the film, but also we're going to have a little discussion about director's cuts, about the sort of idea of what it means to do a director's cut, you know, what was wrong with the original cut, and basically to kick us off on that conversation, really, and to get us thinking about what a director's cut means, why it's important to us, how we feel about it. Tony Robinson actually managed to get some input on this subject from a very esteemed individual who has given us a quote to kind of kick the conversation off. So I'm going to turn over to you, Tony, and you can tell us what you've got here.
Okay, so we were very fortunate to be able to get in touch with Nicholas Meyer himself, the director of the movie, and we asked him if he would like to contribute a quote about this particular version of the movie, because the version of the movie is called the Extended Director's Cut, and this is what he had to say, and this is verbatim from the mouth of Nicholas Meyer.
Still can't believe this, boy.
It's amazing.
This is real, guys.
This is real, and thank you, Nicholas, for doing this. He said, with the possible exception of Orson Welles' posthumous director's cut of Touch of Evil, as implemented by Walter Murch, it's my opinion that so-called director's cuts are rarely improvements on the original release print of a film. They're inevitably longer and not untypically self-indulgent. This includes David Lean's Lawrence of Arabia version, or revision. I never intended my own minor tweaks on The Wrath of Khan to be labelled the director's cut, which I regarded as deceptive advertising at best. I am proud of the original film and happily stand by it. At the same time, there were some minor editorial battles I regretted losing to the studio. Example, Peter Preston's relation to Scotty, the restoration of which I felt enhanced or clarified certain emotional aspects of the film. In my view, it's hardly worth terming a director's cut. And that's the very words of Nicholas Meyer. So now we're going to watch a movie. Is it a director's cut, or is it some marketing ploy by Paramount to extract hard-earned cash?
I think that's a wonderfully... Anyone who's read Nicholas Meyer's autobiography, memoir, which I've plugged on this podcast about 1 million times, will recognise that kind of slightly cynical view of the Hollywood filmmaking process. And I think there's a lot of truth to it. I mean, I think compared to a lot of director's cuts, the Wrath of Khan director's cut is quite minor. There's probably only one element, really, that has a sort of meaning in terms of the story. There's that one significant story element about Scotty's nephew that is definitely, I would say it makes it kind of worthwhile. But whether you call that a director's cut or not, I guess, is sort of an open question.
It's quite possible the term has become just synonymous with different versions of a movie. You get the original film, you go home, you think that was great. A few months later, something happens, and the movie is now 15-20 minutes longer because they've found extra footage. They call it the director's cut. It could quite possibly be that the director has had no say in the matter, but fan demand, public demand makes us want to go see it again. But in Nicholas's words, this bringing Peter Preston, his relationship to Scotty back into the foreground, I think does answer some questions as to why Scotty carried the body of Peter Preston onto the bridge.
It does, definitely, which sort of otherwise maybe seems very dramatic but slightly random, perhaps. And I think a lot of people have said, exactly, why is he on the bridge? Why isn't he taken into sick bay where he could get some treatment,
Why is he so emotionally cut up by it? I know it's a crewman, I know, he's going, but why so much this guy?
And it's kind of interesting. I mean, everyone loves the episode Lower Decks, for example. There's this kind of view of we don't just want to know about the kind of people at the top of the hierarchy. I suppose that is a story element that was in there in the script that was about Scotty and about his nephew. But I suppose partly the fact that it was about Scotty and you expected to care about Scotty, this is something that's always been a bit of an issue with Star Trek, certainly with the original series and the original series movies, is, how much do the other characters, and we see it in Enterprise as well, how much the other characters kind of get pushed to the sidelines. And I suppose, from that point of view, maybe that was something that, in retrospect, Nick Meyer felt, he should have fought for more as a kind of integral element of the story, rather than other people maybe would have seen it as kind of, well, yeah, that's nice, but that's almost, that's kind of by the by. The story works without it. And unquestionably, the story works without it, because I suppose one of the things that we might want to talk about is there's a big difference between a director's cut of a bad film that makes it a good film, and there are a few of those, I think, and a director's cut of a film that is already a fantastic film and is just, like Nicholas Meyer said, tweaking it really, sort of adjusting it slightly, but there wasn't anything wrong with the original cut necessarily.
Yeah, I think he was referring to the scene with Peter Preston that he argued from the outset should never have been cut from the original movie. To reinsert it and then call the movie a different version or an extended version, he thinks is slightly having you over. It's conning you in some way, and I don't think he's unhappy with it from that point of view.
It's conning you.
Oh my God!
Sorry,
it started already.
Yes, indeed.
It's interesting you should talk about director's cuts containing perhaps more character development for small characters. Just because the motion picture, they cut out a few very small scenes, but kind of key scenes that involved minor bridge characters. So, I say minor, they're not minor, but in the film they were kind of minor. So they cut out a scene where Nurse Chapel treats Chekhov on the bridge when he's been injured.
No, Dr. Chapel. She's an MD now.
Sorry, Dr. Chapel. And she should be, man, after all those years. And also having, I think it's Janice Rand at some point in the transporter room. And so they kind of get completely almost squeezed out of the story in the original theatrical release, which is a bit of a shame because I think it makes it seem more like a Star Trek film that has all of the sort of original
especially
characters.
Since they're the women as well.
Yeah,
which is unfortunate, definitely.
That's true.
I suppose that's the question, though, isn't it? It's where's the boundary between, almost with something, especially like Rand, where's the boundary between fan fiction and canon? And and I think with the films they sort of had that. They tried to kind of drop these cameos in from these characters because they were recognisable characters. At the same time, they're not really contributing anything to the story. So it's interesting. I can sort of see either way on that. I mean, I'd say the motion picture is probably the film that, of all the Star Trek films, has benefited the most from its director's cut, because the director's cut fixed a lot of problems, and that was a film that was, very rushed. I mean, famously, the print wasn't dry by the time they were sending it out to theatres because it was so rushed getting that film put together, and I think Robert Wise definitely felt like not that he had been overruled or not that he had been, mistreated in the process of making the film, but just that he hadn't done his best on it because he hadn't had enough time. So in that case, it was very much the director coming in and saying, look, if you give me a bit longer, I'll kind of smooth the rough edges off this. I'll kind of make a better job of it. And definitely in that instance, I think they managed to do that. It is a much better film in the director's cut in that instance.
Part of the problem with the motion picture and the reason it got a bit messy was because they had announced the release date way before they had begun principal photography or they were finished with the special effects. And I know through various sources that another problem that arose was the people who were involved in the visual effects on that movie weren't seeing any of the rushes from the principal photography. So they had a hard time matching up some of the effects they were creating with the actual footage, and it was a real difficulty. Why there was no cross-communication is anybody's business, but that really resulted in a very messy movie being released in December 7th, 1979. I said it in that voice for no reason whatsoever.
Just because you could.
Yes,
you could.
And it sounded
you could.
dramatic.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, I was saying to Tony earlier, I don't think I've ever seen
when you say
when
Tony,
I say Tony, I mean my Tony, Tony Black. Not that you're not my Tony, but my regular Tony.
Clara, have you got Duncan's shovel? He's going to need it.
Regular Tony and
occasional guest Tony.
Special VIP guest Tony.
Exactly.
Walk on Tony.
But anyway, we were talking earlier. I'm not sure that I've ever actually seen the original cut of the motion picture. And I was saying to Tony, my Tony, earlier, when it came to from there, and it's not, I have to say, of all the Star Trek films, it's probably the one I've seen the least, I suspect. And when it came to doing the From There to Here rewatch, I was kind of torn because I'd bought the Blu-ray set of all the movies, so I had this nice high-res version of the original cut of the film, and then I had my old, one of the earliest DVDs I think I ever bought was a DVD of the director's cut of the motion picture, but in standard definition. And so I had this kind of, to and fro, which one am I going to watch? And in the end, I decided to watch the director's cut because I kind of figured, well, okay, it might not pop and look great on the TV, but at the same time, I think this is going to be the better movie.
Can any of you think of an example where a director's cut has actually made the movie worse?
Well, famously, Apocalypse Now Redux made the movie worse.
I'm not suggesting the Wrath of Khan.
Actually, I think controversially,
I fully
maybe.
anticipate great things.
Go on,
Have you? Well, I was just saying, in terms of Star Trek, I actually think The Undiscovered Country possibly makes the movie worse. And I only say that because I had always assumed that the director's cut was the better version of that, and I always liked the fact that it had René Auberjonois in it. I liked this kind of extra element of the story. But actually then, and it was only from doing the From There to Here rewatch, I went to see it at the cinema, and I went to see an old print of the original theatrical cut in the cinema, and then I ended up watching it, I don't know why I ended up watching it twice, but anyway I did. I ended up watching the director's cut at home, and I was really surprised watching the director's cut at home. I was like, these scenes actually are not necessary. This doesn't add to the story. This doesn't help the flow of the story. It's kind of, it's nice in the sense of a deleted scene is nice, but I actually think they made the right decision in the first place. And it's not it doesn't ruin the film. It's not enough to make a huge impact, but I think it actually does damage the pacing slightly.
When the idea of director's cuts as different movies, different versions of the movies came out, I remember being extremely excited that there was a director's cut version of Close Encounters of the Third Kind coming out. And Clara asked earlier, did a director's cut make a movie worse or better? And in my opinion...
Clara is furiously nodding.
She is furiously nodding, yeah. The director's cut version of Close Encounters was terrible. I went to the cinema wondering, what did Roy Neary see when he walked up the ramp into the alien spaceship? You see in the original version his face is lit up and he's staring in wonder at something fantastic, and we don't really get to see what he saw. In the director's version, cut version,
it's a dinosaur.
It was Barney. And he, came along. He was all purple and everything, and he went, surprise. You didn't expect this, did you? No, but the point was, so now you see what Roy Neary saw. And it was just awful. It was just lots of little boxes opening and little lights going on and little people staring out of windows. And was it worth it? No, it wasn't, because they cut other stuff out just to add that scene in. And it was just awful. It was just
But
terrible.
what that's done is that's fundamentally changed a massive component of the film in the sense that now you take away, it's like taking away that element of mystery. It's taking away that element of, like you say, wonder. It's taking away that key essential element at the end, in which was what is he seeing? What has put that look on his face? When a film does that, when it fundamentally changes an emotional reaction or a key point to do with the wonder of the film, then you've got a problem.
And also, I mean, that's one of the key elements of film, is actually what you bring to it. I mean, famously, I can't remember what it was, but in early film there was this example of the woman who is just doing the director tells the actress, just think of nothing, and that is the most moving, powerful moment in the film, because the film constructs, through context and through juxtaposition and cutting and so on, the audience think they know what that person is experiencing, and they project that onto them, and it's actually the actress isn't emoting, they're not doing anything. And in a way, one of the most powerful things about film is what isn't shown as well as what is shown. I mean, even like, say Jurassic Park, for example, the Jurassic Park films work much better when it's dark and you can't really see the dinosaurs and you kind of see snatches of things. Or Jaws, again, looking at Spielberg, Jaws is very effective because you don't see the shark. As soon as you see the shark, it's slightly ruined because the shark looks like a plastic shark. Up till that point, it really works because your imagination is constructing all of this stuff that the filmmakers can't generate. And I actually think, even though these days we have amazing CGI, we have kind of, photorealistic effects to a certain extent, I still think you lose something, even if it looks sort of tangibly real, there is still something that is lost by not having that element that was a key part of film of, you don't see everything, you see some of it and you project a lot of it yourselves.
I think editing is really important, especially in something like science fiction, because often you do have a lot of action in science fiction. You have there's a lot of story to tell in a very short space of time, so you've got to edit quite cleverly. And you've got to question a little bit if a director's cut is sort of the director showing you the art that he wanted to deliver to the audience, or whether it's actually just overblown, sort of stuffed entertainment. Certain films are more entertainment type films, and I think they need more heavy editing because they've got to keep you engaged. And other films, like I'm just thinking of like, Truffaut or who directed The Seventh Seal? Bergman, yeah. And I can imagine a director's cut of an Ingmar Bergman film would be, they're quite slow anyway, really, aren't they? I can imagine it would...
chasing.
Right in the middle of it, yeah.
It was a horse and cart chase.
I suppose the other question is the director always the right person to do the cut? Because I would say of all the Star Trek films, the film that needs recutting the most is Star Trek Nemesis, because we've seen the deleted scenes, we've seen that film could have been a lot better if it had been edited better. Well, they had a hack director who was a good editor, but a good editor in a very kind of frenetic, action, fast-paced way, who didn't have any interest in the franchise, didn't have any interest in those characters, and was not the person, that may be his director's cut, but the director shouldn't have been given the final cut on that. Anyone else should have been given the final cut on that film. And actually, if someone went back and recut that film based on just what they shot and cut it differently, it would be an immeasurably improved. It still might not be a brilliant film, but it would be a much less awful film. And similarly with Star Trek 5, I don't know if you've seen, there's a fan edit of Star Trek 5 which cuts it down to a kind of
3 minutes.
No, it's not. It's like a 50-minute original series episode.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And it actually it works much better as a kind of they cut out a load of stuff and they keep in as much of the best stuff as possible.
God need a ship?
Yeah. and it kind of works. If you see it as a kind of hokey original series episode that's a bit mad and weird, but has some charming moments in it, it kind of works, and it's short and you can enjoy it,
The best
that
line
film
in
needs
Star
hacking
Trek
away
5, and I would repeat this everywhere. Wherever that movie is shown, I would always say, not in front of the Klingons. Because that just brings, come on. But Best line
That was
in
a good
the movie,
moment.
actually.
There are good moments in that film, but it's a film of, and there are good moments in Nemesis, but they...
I would love to see a recut of Star Trek V. I think of all the movies, because I don't think the storyline was particularly bad. I think it suffered from a writer's strike right in the middle. I don't think Shatner was particularly bad as a director. I just think a lot of elements came about that screwed it up for him right at that time, and he didn't need it, and he got a lot of negative publicity, negative press, and typical Shatner. No, it wasn't typical Shatner. He could have done a great job, but he was let down by a lot of elements. So maybe somebody somewhere will take that movie and redo it.
It does feel overly long for the amount of words that are said during the movie. Like, the script feels quite sparse to me, and there seems to be these like pregnant pauses between things that people say. I feel like perhaps they could have edited down the conversations so they were a little bit more punchy.
So, Clara, what are you trying to tell us?
What do you expect if you let William Shatner direct a film? What do you know?
Give me
it's
your
going to be like 95% pauses, isn't it?
Risk is our business.
But I guess this is one of the things that ties into this idea of director's cuts is about length, because often the director's cuts are punishingly long. I mean, I mentioned Apocalypse Now. I've never seen the director's cut of Apocalypse Now because I view watching the original Apocalypse Now, which is a fantastic film and a great work of art and so on, as a bit of an ordeal. And the idea of watching a version of that that's even longer just fills me with horror. But a lot of you can disagree.
No, I don't disagree with you. I actually think it's an arduous film. But it's interesting. I read that Francis Ford Coppola originally showed it to test audiences, the first original version that was quite long.
Yeah.
And the audiences didn't react favourably to certain parts of it.
Right.
And he describes himself as shy at that point, and so he took some of that stuff out. And then he said years later he thought that audiences had changed. So I wonder if that's even a possible option here. Like, if audiences change over the course of however many years of cinemas and films, becoming more popular in certain ways, do then the actual original theatrical releases of films become less
maybe with
successful?
DVD.
Interesting. I mean, if the director had a
makes a
particular point and said, "Look, this is my vision. This is the story from A to B, and this is what I'd like to see on the screen," but the studio say, "No, we need it to be, 2 hours and 10 minutes long, not 2 hours and 45 minutes long. So something's got to go." Well, whatever you cut out of that movie is going to ruin it. It's going to ruin the arc of the story, or it's going to ruin the storyline. So the director had a particular vision, and he's now, the studio is paying him his salary. So what's he going to say? Okay, I'll go with it. Thanks for the check. But years later, as you say, Clara, the audiences demand a little bit more explanation, and an opportunity arises to say, hey, I can show you now what I intended.
But there's also an element of length that, in a just purely commercially, often studios want films to be shorter because you can fit more screenings in a cinema in a day. There are commercial constraints on a film's length that do not apply once you get into DVDs, for example. And I do think a lot of it has to do with when you had VHS. Okay, yes, you could release a new edition of a film and people could watch that instead, and that did happen. But I think once you get DVDs and you get the idea of alternative versions of things, you get deleted scenes, you get extras, you get this whole kind of culture which sort of emphasises the idea that the film itself is not the only thing that you're buying when you buy that product. It plays into this idea that there might be different versions, that there might be alternative ways of seeing this film. There might have been, the various films that didn't quite get made. But I think also there's this question, how much do we value the director? I mean, I said, for example, Star Trek Nemesis directed by a hack director. I don't respect the director. I don't know if anyone else does.
The views of Duncan do not necessarily recommend.
Sorry, okay, whatever. but they probably do respect the views of most Star Trek fans. but there are good directors and bad directors. But there's also, why is with all artists, people have maybe a time of peak creativity often and then decline. And, often someone going back to something that they made 20 years ago, yes, they might want to change things about it, but is that necessarily the right thing? I mean, with Star Wars, we have George Lucas endlessly going back and fiddling with those films and, I want to change this, I want to change... Well, okay, maybe not anymore. But do you know what I mean? Like, is the George Lucas who was like a guy in his 30s in 1970-something or whatever and a bit of a visionary filmmaker necessarily a worse director than the George Lucas who's in his 60s and obsessing over something he made a long time ago?
A lot of people would say he got worse.
Yeah,
but then it depends on the people around him. It depends on the situation, and you could say the same about Ridley Scott. A lot of people would say the same about Ridley Scott, and his Blade Runner is a great example of a film that was absolutely improved by a director's cut. And I come at this as somebody fairly new to Blade Runner, and when I watched the original theatrical cut recently, I was pilloried on Twitter. Like I had like tons of people going,
by me amongst other people.
It's like, what are you doing? You're watching the wrong one. That's not Blade Runner.
Yeah.
And then so I watched. I couldn't believe the vitriol. And then I watched the final cut, as it's called, and it takes away things. That's the crucial thing with that. It doesn't add stuff.
Are you
It takes
saying
stuff
the
away.
voiceover version or the non?
I'm talking about the one that everyone hates, and I wouldn't say I hate, but I'd say I agree it's worse. Is the one with the voiceover?
Yeah.
Is the one with the drip-fed explanation?
It was a dark
Harrison
and
Ford,
stormy night.
Harrison Ford hating doing all that.
But it's
and then you
also
take it away, and it's much more ambiguous. And then you have the ending as well,
which is interesting.
which is interesting and much more ambiguous than the original
Yeah.
happy. It's all wrapped up in a bow ending.
Although allegedly, I've heard the French audiences understood the theatrical cut. Apparently, only in France did audiences take the theatrical cut and interpret the final ending from it. That basically they read it as subtext. That's what I've heard. They read it as subtext. They
everything
watched it.
sounds better in French.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, and and they're existentially troubled, and because they thought that thematically they were because they understood. I mean, this is like the Blade Runner podcast, but they understood that thematically there was a kind of connection between Deckard doing this job, which is kind of meaningless and inhuman and soulless, and these people who are literally not human and don't have souls or whatever. And so they made that connection on a kind of as a reading of the film that no one else picked up on until you got like the director's. Blade Runner had like 7 or 8 cuts. I mean, some of which were called director's cuts, and Ridley Scott had nothing to do with them. And that's why they have this idea of the final cut, which is quite a nice idea for anyone who's concerned about George Lucas or people like that going back and tinkering endlessly and never being satisfied unless the director is dead. I suppose calling something the final cut is about as good as you can get in terms of like saying, right, watch this one. Tony.
Yeah, exactly. I learned my lesson big time.
I think part of the problem with movies being re-released as director's cuts is that there's a huge demand for more of that movie. What could you have done if something else had been left in? And huge pressure on directors to think, well, hang on a minute, did we do something right? Did we do something wrong? And so you end up getting another version of the same movie due to public demand, which doesn't make the movie better or necessarily even worse, but it puts the director under an enormous amount of pressure to produce something they hadn't intended to produce in the first time. So we get these movies, and now because a movie has come out with a director's cut, now we have these expectations that, hey, I'll watch this movie, but I know in 6 months' time we're going to get this other version, and it'll have all the deleted scenes, and it'll make much more sense, and it might last for 4 hours, but hey, it'll be worth it. So it's a kind of hypocrisy and a kind of a dishonest expectation, and it kind of is disingenuous to the director's original work. They manage to produce with what they're given what the final cut should be, and they're happy, and they sign it off, and they go away and live on their yacht in the Bahamas.
If they're lucky, yeah. Well, I think we saw that even with the X-Men Days of Future Past. I'm pretty sure when that film came out in the cinema, there was talk about this longer cut that was going to be released on DVD, and then it was released on DVD, and everyone said, oh, it was better, it all made sense, because you understood why. I can't remember why Anna Paquin was in one scene and not in another, or it's like it resolved certain problems. And I suppose there is, I feel like we've talked about this before. This idea of like
It's a time loop episode.
It's starting to turn into a time loop episode. 'Cause I can't remember if I talked with you or I talked with someone else when you were away. Anyway, but this idea of like what. Because I think the idea of the deleted scene and what is the role of the deleted scene, and do you when you watch a film with deleted scenes, do you want to incorporate them? Do you want to kind of imagine you've incorporated them? I mean, The Measure of a Man, actually, there's a version on the Blu-ray which has all deleted scenes dropped back in. That's basically a extended cut. But I think what does it mean to include all this extra material? And I think what I'm thinking of is, with the J.J. Abrams Star Trek movies, there were those comics, right? And the first movie, the 2009 movie, I felt every time I've watched it, I sort of felt, well, that movie doesn't really work for me the way that it does for a lot of people, because I think it doesn't really make sense. I don't really understand what's going on. And then I read the comics and I was like, okay, I understand this. I understand where Nero's coming from. I sort of get the backstory. But I have a real reservation about that. I'm kind of like, well, if that's part of the story, that should be in the film. It's no good saying, yeah, you can go and read the comic and then you'll understand the film, because most people aren't going to go and read the comic. No. Well, and I think that, yes, you have to cut stuff for time. Yes, there's this, there are these questions about, like, you don't want it to be bloated or whatever. But the danger is that if you, say with that X-Men example, if what was being said was, yes, there's this film in cinemas, it's fun, go and watch it, but wait 6 months and you can watch the version that actually makes sense of what's going on, that to me seems like a bit of a flaw, because that's basically saying, yeah, we're releasing something that doesn't make sense.
I think they do this with TV shows as well. So I'm thinking of, like, for instance, the X-Files, that they released the X-Files. I suppose the X-Files finished and then they released a whole bunch of comics to sort of carry on the story. But recently I watched Stranger Things 2, which is on Netflix. And I came to work and I was discussing it with my work colleagues, and quite a few of my work colleagues said, I feel like they filmed a lot more and they must have cut some stuff out of it, because there were certain scenes that didn't seem to flow with other scenes, and there were certain episodes that seemed much more filled with events and episodes that had less in them. And I thought that was interesting. I mean, I'm not sure if that's actually true, but it's now people are even thinking that when they go and see something, they have the assumption that things are being cut. Even
they're
without,
always going to film scenes that they hope will end up in the finished edited version, because they have to. They end up on the cutting the floor, and it's a shame, but that's just the way it is.
But where do you draw the line between what should be in there, like you're saying, in order to make sense, and what is cut for time reasons, for money reasons, for things like that? I mean, to go back to the Wrath of Khan, arguably adding that scene in with Peter Preston adds that level of characterisation. It doesn't change the film. It doesn't really particularly change the story. You don't have to have any of that subplot in there. But without that context of knowing that it's not just a random crewman who's died at the hands of this attack, knowing that it means something to somebody in that crew, it adds an extra level, an extra dimension to what you're watching that enhances the whole thing. So I think it makes sense to put that back in there. Whether or not it was cut in the first place for the right reasons is the question.
Well,
was it all? Did he always intend that to be in there? Did he then change his mind at the last minute? Does he regret it?
Well,
it's things like that. It's the question, and you can ask that about a lot of films.
In my opinion, the idea of Peter Preston and the relationship with Scotty and the whole idea of it is almost superfluous, because in reality it doesn't make any sense to the storyline. The storyline is Khan has, taken control of the Reliant. He's figuring out a way of trapping Kirk and the Enterprise, and or he's discovered Kirk as an admiral, and he's enticing the Enterprise to come in, and he's going to get him for and this idea of somebody on board the Enterprise who just happens to be related to the chief engineer gets hurt and killed, and it ends up being a thing. It's almost, it didn't even have to be there. It could have been any crew member that Scotty might have been concerned about.
Yeah, it could have been.
The fact that he was related is kind of...
I think the ultimate point is that it's trying to show that there are consequences and stakes for, what Khan is doing. It's not just, he's attacked them, shields up, bit of a blast, and then we're fine. Somebody's died. But you're right, it doesn't necessarily have to be.
Lots of people on the Enterprise died in that sequence, and
But we don't know them. We don't know who they are.
But
And
we
it's
do-
shorthand,
but we-
isn't
we
it? By
do-
saying,
yeah.
by
But
saying it's Scotty's cousin, it's Scotty's nephew, it's shorthand for saying care about this person.
Yeah, yeah,
They're
yeah.
a real person, not just a number.
For
you know,
right
they're
or wrong.
like
And I agree with you. It doesn't have to necessarily be his nephew.
Yeah, it could have been, you know,
his protege, or
Yeah.
you know,
or a Yeoman
Yeah.
Rand
Yeah.
type character.
And there's no building to that. You know, he's not in the motion picture, or he's not
No.
in particularly really in earlier scenes, maybe in one or two. So it's not a big thing. But I think the whole purpose is to add that level of threat. You know, in theory, any of them somebody could die. Obviously, at the end, somebody does die
Yeah.
in inverted commas. But it you know.
yeah, so it sets that up. I mean, so that's another way of looking at it, isn't it? It sets up the loss of someone that's very close to you. Someone's, you know, it's a sort of prefiguration in a sense.
And didn't they market the film by suggesting that someone was going to die?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Could have been a trick. Could have been a red herring. Oh,
Second red herring.
yeah.
Oh,
Halfway
yeah,
through, they're
yeah,
like,
yeah.
oh yeah, it's Scotty's nephew. Fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what that's exactly the J.K. Rowling trick, isn't it? You
Yeah.
know, because every time they released a new Harry Potter book, they'd say, "Oh, you know, one of the characters is going to die," and you know, it would always turn out to be. I mean, spoilers for anyone who hasn't read Harry Potter or watched them or whatever. Okay, I know like Dumbledore died, and that was a big deal.
You all
But
care.
other than that, they were usually the
Clara cares.
expectation.
Clara
No,
cares.
you whatever. I mean, I care a bit, but the expectation is that
Duncan's
is
views
that-
do not necessarily represent the Trek FM network.
I'm going to get sacked soon if I'm not careful. The expectation is that people. Is that you think it's going to be a major character who dies, and then it's, you know, Ron Weasley's brother, and it's like, okay, that's sad, you know. I know, okay, Clara's upset by it, but at the same time, it's not that sad. It's not as sad as what you're expecting.
It's not as sad as sort of Hermione or Harry dying.
Exactly,
Right,
exactly,
yeah.
and that's what we
Dead?
were expecting, you know.
No, it's Fred.
Yeah, exactly. You don't even know which one it was, do you?
No, it's really George.
Welcome to the Harry Potter podcast on the Trek FM network. But you know,
Patronus culture.
Oh, I love it.
Have any of you read the novelisation of The Wrath of Khan? Because Peter plays quite a Peter Preston plays quite a, I won't say prominent, but there's a backstory in it. And this backstory about his mother and Scotty, and how Scotty's sister doesn't like the idea of Peter being in Starfleet, and she kind of makes Scotty promise to take care of Peter, which makes his death a lot more serious.
Yeah.
And that Peter and Savick themselves have a friendship, and that itself also means that Savik's much more affected by Peter's death, and then equally doubly affected by Spock's death because she's lost two people that she cares about.
So in some respects, this is the author's cut.
So
Yeah, I don't know if the book was written.
Isn't it?
The book was probably written after the movie. Yeah, I assume. I mean,
Well, not always.
but often
not,
the book can incorporate stuff that is in the
Is in the
script and
scripts,
not in the
yeah,
final
yeah,
film.
yeah.
And that's the thing, isn't it? Is that it can you do get that sometimes with those kind of ancillary things that they
Novelizations.
So when they
novelisation
get
the
or
scripts
comics or whatever
sometimes
exactly,
before
and
it's
they
even
pick
been
up something
filmed
that
or
ends
while
up
it's
being
been filmed.
changed.
when,
or yeah.
when they were having a
It's interesting.
funeral for
Really
Peter
interesting.
Preston, did Captain Kirk say, of all the souls, his was actually the most human?
I think Spock would be really offended by that.
Yeah.
Every time Kirk says that, I'm like, Spock doesn't want to be human. Spock's not doing it.
Spock's not dead at this point.
That's true. Yeah.
It's all right, you can get away with it. You can say what you like at someone's funeral, can't you?
But that thing about the book, that is interesting because it does make you wonder, was that in a original screenplay? And you know, there were quite a lot of screenplays written for the Wrath of Khan. You know, it was you know, cobbled together by a lot of different things. You know, was there a screenplay where there was more of that done? But then, if that had been in the film, it would have really bogged the film down. You know, ultimately, wouldn't it? I mean, why are we focusing so much on Scotty's nephew, who we've never seen before? Why do we care? But we should care for Scotty when he dies, and that's the key.
Yeah.
It's not in a way. It's not Peter we're caring about. It's Scotty.
And I think we
It's the
don't need
effects.
that much to care. I mean, I think in the director's cut that we're watching today, it's enough for you to care. Do you know what I mean? It's enough
Yeah,
to establish
yeah.
that he's his nephew. Scotty's a nice guy. He cares about his nephew. His nephew dies. That's awful. Do you know what I mean? You don't need a lot. I mean, you don't need all that. I mean, not to say that backstory is not
it's
interesting
true,
or
yeah.
whatever, but you don't need all that
Yeah.
backstory in order to invest in that. But you're right. I mean, you know, that is an element like we don't really care about Peter Preston. We care about Peter Preston because we care about Scotty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree.
Just in terms of this idea...
It turned Scotty to drink.
Yeah. Well, I think he'd been turned to drink
I
a
don't
long
think he
way
has to worry
before
about
that.
that,
Yeah.
I think he's all right. Got that down.
I was just going to say, in terms of like we talked about good directors' cuts, we talked about different options of like, is something missing or whatever. I mean, one of the, we talked about Star Wars, the idea of going back to something and adding to it or rejigging it or whatever. I would say the Lord of the Rings films are an example of something where the both cuts work quite well, generally speaking. I mean, you go to the cinema, you watch the theatrical cut, it feels like a complete movie. It doesn't feel like there's anything missing. You don't feel like something doesn't make sense, or like they've left something in the comic, or they've left something on the cutting room floor or whatever. Then you go and watch the extended cut and you're like, oh yeah, this is kind of interesting, and that's great. So I think it is possible to kind of balance those two things. But those films, I think, were made with the expectation that they were going to release those longer versions.
Yeah.
Certainly, I mean, maybe that wasn't the case of the first one, but certainly, once they get into them and then they get into the Hobbit films, they keep doing it. They know that's always going to happen. They know they're always going to shoot too much, and they're always going to create two versions of that film, both of which basically work, but at different lengths.
Well, in this very cinema we're sitting, the Prince Charles Cinema in London's Leicester Square.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Turner.
For our global listeners.
They did recently a Lord of the Rings extended cut back-to-back screening, and I've done some of the overnight screenings. They did it when I did a James Bond 6 film screening overnight, which was great fun. Believe me, if you ever get the chance to do one of these,
we meet again, Mr. Bond.
Yeah.
Didn't we meet just
2 hours ago?
yes, but we meet again, Mr. Bond.
But they did all three.
All six.
They did. Well, God, that's the thing. But they did all three. And that would have been roughly, I think, about 12 hours with a break in between. So I reckon they're about 4 hours each, aren't they? Roughly.
I thought they were three. Are they three? Are they the theatricals are 3, and then the an extra half an hour.
The extended ones, they're about 3.5 hours, 4 hours.
I don't know. I did
About
one of those
4 hours.
marathons at a friend's party once, but I have to say I fell asleep halfway through the Return of the King.
There's no way
halfway through the 2 towers. But this thing, I fell asleep in them. I had a nap, basically. I had a nice nap in the middle, and then woke up for the end.
Like in Rohan.
Yeah,
And nothing had changed.
But surely that, and obviously you wouldn't do them 12 hours on the bounce normally, but surely 4 hours a piece is too long. Even for something like Lord of the Rings, which is so dense and complicated. That doesn't beat the top one. They're doing here at the end of November all 7 seasons of Game of Thrones back to back, right?
What, in one night?
In 4 nights, right?
Yeah,
when do you eat?
You don't. You don't. Right? They are honestly showing them.
You stay here.
Yeah, you stay here for 4 days. I'm not making this up.
I mean, I don't watch Game of Thrones, but are there like some crap episodes that you can skip and go and sleep or eat?
Probably. But the problem is, you will lose track of where you are if you go
I don't
into
think
that.
there's crap episodes.
Well, not. Yeah, and there's none. There's some you could miss, but you'd still like. No, you've got to do it, right?
Yeah. You're watching people die again. And again.
That's 4 days.
It's really depressing.
Yeah. So there you go.
but
That's
there's
the old.
Sex death.
There's dragons. Yeah, but there's dragons.
Yeah, you just sleep through the death, wake up for the sex bit. Yeah. But no, we're getting slightly off topic in terms of thing. But it's that whole thing.
If you're listening, Nicholas Meyer, you'll probably
you think that 2 minute extra scene's a lot?
Yeah, you'll have turned us off by now.
Does that? Is there such a thing as a too long? Is there such a thing as too long cut? I mean, I think it could be.
Yes, definitely. There have been rumours, haven't there, that Nicholas Meyer, as well as working on Star Trek Discovery, is working on a secret Khan miniseries.
Oh, yeah.
Which obviously ties into this idea, what is missing. I mean, Nick Meyer says in his quote that he sent to us that, he views himself as tinkering with this film. He's not reinventing it. But that suggests that there is something left in that story that he thinks is still worth developing, that he hasn't kind of left that storyline behind in a way.
Well, we don't find out what happens to Khan and his followers when they're stuck on the planet. What planet?
Ceti Alpha 5. It's Ceti Alpha 5.
It's just Ceti Alpha 5. Alpha 6 exploded. The city Alpha.
So like, it's the whole point of like, how do they survive in this terrible environment? How did that exposure affect them?
Gentlemen, 2001 will resume in about 5 minutes. Thank you.
We are in a time loop, Tony.
Yes.
This is the 2001st
We're going back
time we've
16
done this.
years.
We're partying like it's 1999.
Sorry, Clara, what were you saying?
So yeah, just that I read that on the internet that there was actually an early draft or scene where Khan actually had a small child, either it was his child or grandchild or something that existed, and that the small child was on the Botany Bay when Chekhov arrived, and that's one of the first things they saw was the baby.
The child would have been the son or daughter of the lady of the Enterprise.
Marla McGivers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Marla McGivers? Is that her name?
McGivers.
She sounds like a superhero.
Or like a grandchild. Yeah.
Marla McGivers!
She could escape
Historical research woman.
No, great granddaughter of MacGyver.
Yeah,
Yeah, that
exactly.
too.
Something like that, yeah.
And at the very end of the Wrath of Khan, when the Genesis device explodes, one of the last shots was going to be a baby crawling on the transporter pad, and then touching the Genesis device as it explodes, which is a lot darker and also presents Khan's family and Khan's group of people slightly more sympathetically.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? And I suppose there is that theme of rebirth and children, and there was that theory that Joachim, is that his name? One of Khan's guys might be related to him. You know, and I suppose one of the things that these director's cuts play into is, you know, and fan fiction plays into, and these comics play into, and all these things play into, is this idea of what is there beyond the film. You know, is the finished product all there is? And you know, sometimes that plays in because there's something that we're not happy with. I mean, Tony and I have talked before about the
Ladies and gentlemen, if you're here for 2001 A Space Odyssey, please take your seats in the downstairs screen as the film will resume in a couple of minutes.
I feel like we've heard this announcement before.
Oh, yeah. It sounds like we're recording an airport.
Yeah, otherwise, Hal will be closing the book and you will not get it.
Tony and I have talked about when we were talking about action movies. We talked about the Alien 3, and not a director's cut, a director's cut that the director was not in any way involved in. But you know, I watched that cut having seen the original one many years before, and really loved it. I thought it was, you know, really transformed the film. So I suppose there's that kind of question of, first of all, you know, who is it just the director who can improve something? Because obviously there are other people who can come in and say, actually this thing was missing, or this thing could have been done differently. But also, what is our kind of interest beyond the film itself, beyond the thing that we've been given? You know, we want to know about what was happening beforehand. We want the prequel. We want the information about this. We want the deleted scenes. We want more. We want all this kind of extra stuff in a way, and that maybe is part of the way that we consume film and the way we consume culture these days. Is that we, you know, it's not. We don't.
This is the final call for 2001 A Space Odyssey. Please take your seats. The film is about to resume. Thank you.
And ironically, it's not the final cut, and that's really the point. Other than, you know, Ridley Scott saying it's the now this is the final cut. That's the question. When we go and see a film at the cinema, is that a finished work of art that we're seeing, or is it kind of a work in progress? Is it a kind of starting point for conversations? Is it a kind of, or for imaginations, or for kind of seeing where these characters can go, or whatever? And obviously Star Trek is unusual in the degree of fan fiction and kind of, you know, we talk now about extended universes, don't we, in Star Wars and Star Trek and so on. You know, the thing, the product, the piece of art itself, or whatever it is not the be-all and the end-all. There's more around it. And I suppose all of that kind of ties into this idea that seems like nothing is ever really finished, you know. I mean, in 10 years' time, if Nick Meyer decides he wants to go back and fiddle with his film again, who's going to stop him?
2001 A Space Odyssey is resuming right now. Please take your seats.
Fortunately, Stanley Kubrick is not in a position to recut 2001 A Space Odyssey.
And there are deleted scenes that could be reinserted. We found a couple of weeks ago they found 18 minutes of footage that hadn't been included.
Just leave it alone.
The difficulty
Doesn't
is,
need a final cut.
No, that is the defining movie of my life, 2001 Space Odyssey. We need to do a
2001
primitive culture.
Definitely. No, I'd love that.
Yeah.
Okay, this is my confession. I've never seen 2001 Space Odyssey.
No, I hadn't until last year.
Really?
Yeah.
You need to
Okay,
watch
well,
it.
the four of us should get together. We should have done it today, frankly.
They'll play it
We'll
again.
come back again.
We'll come
Next
back
time
again
they're
and
doing
we'll do
it, we'll come back and we'll do it. And you can tell us how to find your life, and
Yeah.
Clara and I can tell you what we make of it, and Tony
Well,
can
there
say
are
whatever.
connections. There are connections between Star Trek and 2001.
Of course.
Yeah,
Well, the
yeah,
motion,
exactly.
I get that the motion picture is heavily influenced by it. I've seen
No.
enough of it to
No.
pick up on stuff, but I've never
Both
actually watched it.
movies, visual effects were done by Doug Trumbull.
Yeah.
Who photographed, oddly enough, Discovery, which is 2001: The Spaceship, which, in terms of a model, which it was, on a stage, was 60 feet long. And there's one scene in 2001 where the ship is just passing from left to right.
Yeah.
It took 24 hours to film.
Oh my
frame
God.
by frame by frame by frame.
It's amazing.
And Doug Trumbull did that.
And the Tree of Life.
And Doug Trumbull filmed the Enterprise leaving space dock.
Yeah,
I hate
that's
that
true.
There's
I thought you. Okay, there's a
No, I love and hate it.
Yeah,
Same
so
thing.
that's fine. That's all right. I
That's
don't
another
mind
story,
that.
though.
That's all right. We can
There
talk
are
about
a few
that.
teasers of
over dinner.
future primitive cultures here.
Yeah.
Kudos to Nick Meyer.
Yeah.
What I wanted to say about Nick Meyer and Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan was that Nick changed Star Trek forever. He got an opportunity to direct a movie. He grabbed it by its neck and he did a fantastic job. There's no denying that. But in doing so, he changed the direction of Star Trek. He changed the direction of where this franchise would go indelibly and forever. He set a tone for the movie. He gave Starfleet a more militaristic aspect. He created a whole ranking system of people that was never clearly defined in the original series. Yes, people were referred to as commander or lieutenant or admiral, but it really wasn't defined by ranking pins or uniform status until Nick Myers brought that in. And he brought in an idea that people could perish during the course of their service in Starfleet and perish badly, and there will be consequences. So Nick Meyer, I think, has to be applauded for what he did. Other people picked up the baton, but Nick Meyer set the bar, and I think that bar has never been exceeded.
And also that our heroes could make mistakes. I mean, Kirk is a very fallible character in that film in a way that he wasn't really in the original series, and we see that going forward. We see that going through, for example, in Cisco and Deep Space Nine doing kind of questionable things and struggling with it. We certainly see that in Discovery, this idea that, just because someone's in Starfleet doesn't mean that they're infallible, and I think really he had a big part in realising the world of Star Trek in some ways, in bringing it, in tying it into our world in some ways, in sort of psychologically tying it into our world. And, it's a big part of why it's kind of strange, isn't it? If you look at the Next Generation TV series and the movies, the movies seem quite shallow in a way often compared to the TV series. With the original series, they seem quite deep. There's a lot of character development, there's a lot of kind of they feel like real people, and I think a lot of that stems from stuff that started in the Wrath of Khan, really. Yeah. Well, it's been great talking about the Wrath of Khan this evening, but before we go, why don't you all tell our listeners where they can get hold of you, or where they can listen to you on Trek FM, and where they can get hold of you online. Let's start with you, Tony.
Well,
Which
Duncan,
Tony?
Tony, not my Tony.
yes.
Sorry.
A tale of two Tonys. Yeah. Well, Duncan, it's been an honour to be here and to discuss the Wrath of Khan with you here at the Prince Charles Theatre in London. Prince Charles.
Yeah, I'm sorry, that was my fault. I went all American.
Well, actually, it's
That's what podcasting for Trek FM does to you.
I know. Prince Charles Cinema here, just off Leicester Square in London. So fantastic. So apologies for all the noise you heard in the background, but that's just we are in the depths of the cinema and people are coming in and going. I'm Tony Robinson. I'm the host of Continuing Mission. You can find me on the Babel Conference, which is the Trek FM Facebook page. If you go to BABEL on Facebook, you'll find us, and please join us and join in the discussion. That'll be fantastic. And also, if you wish to find me on Twitter, I'm on Shamrock165.
So thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed it. So you can find me I'm podcasting for the XCast podcast, which is a podcast, which Tony does, and also writing for a website called Set the Tape, which is also a project of Tony's.
Clara just loves me.
Are you on Tony's payroll now?
One day.
Living in the spare room.
And on Twitter at Clara Cook MC.
And you can find me on Twitter. No, I'm doing it like this voice. You can find me on Twitter. AJ Black Writer, and Set the Tape, at Set the Tape for my website, Set the Tape. And if you want to find my other podcast, The Xcast, just go and find the X_cast, all about the X-Files.
And if you want to contact me, you can find me on Twitter at Barrett's Books, that's BARRETT. Or if you want to read about my thoughts on Star Trek, there's a special Twitter account for my Star Trek book, Star Trek The Human Frontier, at Human Trek. And you can also find me, of course, as with all our other lovely hosts and friends, on the Babel Conference. Well, it's been fun talking about director's cuts in Star Trek and beyond this evening at the Prince Charles Theatre in London's Leicester Square. But that's not the only thing we've been talking about this week on Trek FM, so here's a listen to some of the other things you might have missed out on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, the 602 Club.
I know, I went all in. I think if it came up short, I think there was going to be a lot of screen caps with a lot of people. I think even on podcasts, I've been throwing it all out. Oh, this is going to be one of the best. Trust me on this one. Yeah, Thor 2, ignore that. This one will be the bee's knees, as it were. So, yeah, there was a lot of pressure. Right? I don't think just on Marvel and Taiki Waititi, but on me, myself, with my audacious claims.
The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
And with the final argument that he has with Burnham at the end of the episode, right? Everywhere that Burnham is, she's taking away from him, and that's how he feels, right? We as the audience see it differently, but according to Saru, Burnham is always taking, and destroying Saru's life by taking all this stuff.
Meta Treks.
But it was 1977 that Kunzel went off and started recording with the Cincinnati Pops. And basically the Cincinnati Pops and Eric Kunzel saved the Telarc record label back in the 80s when they recorded the 1812 Overture. And that was such a huge record, and classical records weren't doing so well back in the early 80s.
Standard Orbit.
I wonder how they combined the matter of the two of them. Is there a setting where it's just like combined or not combined?
Obviously. It's that little blinking blue button that's kind of shaped like a warped Skittle on the right side that does that.
Oh, God. I'll look for that in those close-ups of not James Doohan's hands next time I watch the episode.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So check out all of these shows and join in the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published. And please do leave us a star rating and a written review at the same time. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. If you'd also like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/trekfm, that's patreon.com/trekfm, to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, the Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/trekfm. Duncan and I would love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to get involved and do just that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. You can find Duncan and I on the Babel Conference as well, and you can find us both on Twitter, Duncan at Barrett's Books, and myself, Tony, at Black Hole Media. And you can also find me hosting my own podcast, the Xcast and X-Files podcast, if you type that into Twitter and Facebook. So thanks everyone for listening to this episode of Primitive Culture. We'll be back soon to discuss more history, culture, and how Star Trek relates to it.
You're blended, all right.
I'll get everyone to introduce themselves, maybe. Or I can introduce them.
Don't worry if it goes wrong, we'll release a director's cut later.
The extended
It'll be twice as long.
extended director's cut.
Twice as long.
Actually, that's right.
Yeah.